To start our view and lesson into the impact of the Great War and how it changed Canada, there's a few things we want to get started. To begin, we want to know what were the six great powers and then the two not so great powers and their impact on Canada before the war. To start with, we go to Great Britain. As we covered in our previous lesson of the size and also the importance of Great Britain was essentially a superior nation because they had started to industrialize first before any other nation did. The whole advantage of coal and iron was very incredibly useful. And as we covered before, the empire consisted of 1/4 of their surface. They had the naval supremacy like a two standard level. Essentially, the British ruled the seas, their navy was top notch, and they had economic superiority. They were a very much powerful colonial power um, at that point. For Germany, Otto von Bismarck was the leader of Prussia. Prussia was the united German states, and he united them through a series of wars. His policy of Blutunsinn was used to defeat the French in the Franco-Prussian War beforehand. Prussia and France were rivals in Europe. And now Germany, because of the success of the war against France, now had a presence on the world stage. And the Bismarck, the leader, had dreams of greater aspirations because of that. To achieve a greater dominance, Germany, or Prussia, had to develop the von Schlieffen Plan, which was a plan to try to essentially defeat the Western powers first and then relocate to the east. It basically was based upon the idea of speed, strength, and slow Russians. The idea of slow Russians because they use a different calendar. The idea was to commit over 90% of Germany's forces in the first couple of weeks to essentially defeat Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France, secure the perimeter, and relocate to the east before the time the Russians were able to mount any sort of serious counteroffensive. Now, speaking of Russia, Russia was trying hard to create a modern state there. And while they had a large army, the leader, the Kaiser's army, was incredibly poorly supplied. But they wanted to go to war to gain a warm water port so they have access to those European markets and also to get greater sort of power and presence. Russia had, well, there was issues starting to develop in Russia, and these issues would definitely manifest into the Communist Revolution by 1917. France was an old and stable country whose superiority was being challenged by Germany, power from the Napoleon times and also the French Empire. And after the British, the French had the second largest empire in the world. But there was a lot of hatred towards the Germans because of the war with the Bismarck and the loss of the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire was referred to as the Ramshackle Empire, and that's because of the incredible diversity of ethnic groups that consist in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. They wanted to go to war to prove their legitimacy. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire was created after Napoleon's defeat in Waterloo back in 1814 and the result of the Congress of Vienna, where this boundary was laid out. But it had severe, deep ethnic problems that would actually be the triggers for the war. Italy, on that hand, had a shortage of everything. While they had lots of people, they just did not have the experience nor the supplies to carry out. But Italy wanted to go to war because they wanted to reestablish portions of the former Roman Empire or portions of an empire at all in Africa. It's part of a much larger land grab that was part of Africa in the decades leading up to the war. If those are the great powers, then what were the not so great powers? And there was two of them. The first not so great was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was also referred to as the Sick Man Empire. While still were military potent and significant, the Ottoman Empire was definitely at a point it was dying out. There, as you can see in the map, it was continuing to lose territory. The Ottomans had been a great power once, but it was now declining away. And once the war was over at the Treaty of Versailles, the Ottoman Empire essentially ceased to exist after that. And the other not so great power was the United States. And the reason why they were not so great was because the United States, while economically and industrializing powerful nation, the American government was an isolationist. While they were busy in the past acquiring a bit of an empire in the Pacific and also in the Caribbean, there was not the political will to actually follow through and keep those territories. For all intents and purposes, the United States was an isolationist. So if that was the six great powers and two not so great powers, what about Canada? As we remember, this is all about how did the war affect and change Canada. So at the beginning of the war, Canada came up with a plan of how to mobilize 25,000 volunteers called the Expeditionary Force. Within the first couple months, they had already had 30,000. Colonel Sam Hughes was a very controversial minister of militia who did not trust professional soldiers. And because of that distrust, he set up Valcartier Camp to train 32,000 people to become soldiers. And while they showed old training films, they did old battle techniques there. Essentially, lots of marching or bayoneting, riding horseback. The tactics that the Canadians were being trained would not be useful at a time of mechanized warfare such as gas or machine guns and artillery. To compound the additional problems, there was the Ross rifle, which was the rifle that was supported by Sam Hughes. The Ross rifle was a terrible weapon. It was not good for modern trench warfare, especially once the mud arrived. It'll jam, it'll seize during rapid fire, and the Ross rifle was not compatible with British bullets from the Lee Enfield. Sam Hughes would not want to change his gun, but British suppliers would encourage Canadians to basically grab British rifles of the Lee Enfield along the front. Canadian forces, the expeditionary force once arrived in Europe, would spend the winter of 1914 in tents on the Salisbury plain to be retrained by British officials, which did, of course, once again include lots of marching. In the war, there was lots of government censorship of all types of news that would be considered harmful to the war effort. Canadian propaganda posters, such as shown here, will appear to glorify the Great War and the effort that everyone has a part, man, woman, and child, everyone has a part to play in the war. And this will soon be part of the War Measures Act there. And across the nation, Canadians would rally for the war effort. Church groups and women's organizations and charities would spring into action. It was essentially starting to turn into a wartime society. And another thing about the Wartime Society was the Canadian Patriotic Fund, which was an act, a law that was passed by Parliament, run by volunteers, where it would collect money for families to survive on only $1.10 a day of a soldier's pay. And in 3 months, they raised about $6 million, which gave families about $50 a month there. It also, the Patriotic Fund led to co-op stores where families could buy food and fuel. This is total war. Society was a wartime society. Another example of a wartime society was the Soldiers of the Soil, where 12,000 boys helped out on Canadian farms because lots of the men or the older guys had gone off to war. So instead of letting the fields go to rot and spoil, the boys would leave school to prevent the crop failures and food shortages. And on top of that, families would practice rationing. They would voluntarily change their eating and consumption habits of items such as butter, meat, sugar, wheat, and fuel. And so these items could also be saved and sent over to the Western Front for the war effort. Other than soldiers, Canada's main contributions were food and munitions, and once war had been declared, Britain relied even heavily, the British Empire that is, relied heavily on the Canadian farming, the Canadian prairies, because access to the markets of Russia was no longer possible, as well as the fields of France were then to turn into the Western Front with the trenches and the warfare for it. And also on top of that, 1915 was actually a really good season for growing. The greater production farms were established on native reserves to help use funds for it, but intensive wheat farming would lead to the devastation of the soil later on. But by 1917, Canada had shipped millions of dollars worth of shells and explosives. There was over 600 factories along with 250,000 people. Canadian industrialists saw a great opportunity to make profit, which led to insane amounts of corruption and profiteering there. Even Sam Hughes' Shell Committee was disbanded by the Prime Minister, Robert Borden, and were replaced by the Imperial Munitions Board led by Joseph Flavelle, the Baron of Bacon, because profiteering on the war effort. But by 1918, the last year of the war, Canada's manufacturing expanded to airplanes, engines, guns, cargo ships, chemicals, and other weapons of war. There was over 1,500 factories with 360,000 people employed. This was a wartime society. This was total war. Everyone had a job to play, but there was that issue of the profiteering, and also the conscription crisis of 1917, the mandatory enlistment into the armed forces, which we covered before, and was the real starting roots of the Quebecois and the independence movement in Quebec. For profiteering in the scandal, the government relied on private enterprises to direct the wartime economy, and industrial scandals and the profiteering were rampant and incredibly pervasive. People saw millionaire industrialists growing richer from dishonest dealings such as the Ross rifle, while everyone was making the sacrifices and the rationing and cutting back on food and consumption of fuel and food there. So there was a outcry against this. And Borden, the Prime Minister, promised not to interfere with the business in 1914. But by 1916, he had appointed a fuel controller to prevent the industrialists from hoarding the coal and fuel. And instead of rolling back food price increases, many Canadians expected the food controller asked Canadians to stop eating so much and to change their taste. This is another form of the wartime effort. And another thing too was how to pay for this war. Plagued by corruption and profiteering inefficiencies, the cost of the war by 1918 was costing Canada, 1918, $1 million. It was becoming incredibly burdensome of a financial burden to pay for. Actually, a lot of the debt still exists as part of our national debt today. And so Borden's government tried to find new types of taxes to pay for this. And one of the taxes was income tax, which still exists today, and business taxes on personal income, which still exists today, but even that did not make a change. What actually did make a change in the end were victory bonds there, where in 1915 they can begin, 1917 they raised this much money. Essentially, you lend the money to the government a few years, and then you get your money back with a small percentage. This actually did help to raise some much needed funds for the war effort. So from victory bonds, children of soil, wartime rationing, unfortunately profiteering, factories, men and women and child. This is what total war effort looked like for Canada and how the change would begin for Canada in the war.